I still think about the sound it made. Not the slap. Everyone talks about the slap. That moment got replayed on 14 different galactic news feeds, translated into 63 languages, argued about in the conclave chambers for 3 consecutive weeks. The slap became a political event, a symbol. Senators wrote speeches about it. The Vethrani ambassador demanded formal reparations. The Human Diplomatic Corps issued 4 separate press releases in 48 hours. But the sound I remember, the one that started all of it, was small, quiet. The kind of sound you wouldn't even notice unless you were standing in the right place at the right moment, paying attention to the wrong person. It was the sound of hair being pulled. And I was standing close enough to hear it. My name is Sergeant First Class Delia Marsh, Human Defense Auxiliary, seconded to the Terran Cultural Exchange Program, and I was supposed to be watching the cafeteria monitors, not eating lunch. That's the thing about the way bureaucracy works in a joint station. Someone always gets pulled from their actual post to cover someone else's break, and that day it was me covering PVT. Yusuf's lunch while he ran to the medical bay with a reaction to something in the Keth food line. Which meant I was standing at the edge of the main atrium with a half-eaten protein wrap in one hand and a monitoring tablet in the other, watching approximately 200 students from 11 different species try to eat lunch without accidentally insulting each other. It was, up until that moment, a completely ordinary Thursday. Let me tell you about Valen Station first, because if you've never been here, you can't picture it. And if you can't picture it, none of what happened next makes any sense. Chapter 2. Valen Station Level 7, Atrium D. Valen Station sits at the edge of the Kareth Corridor, which is one of those regions of space that sounds poetic, until you realize it's mostly a navigational nightmare. Gravity wells that don't behave predictably, relay satellites that have a habit of going quiet during storm seasons, and about 400 years of contested territorial history compressed into a narrow band of star systems that every major species wants a piece of but nobody wants to maintain. The station itself is enormous. Not enormous in the way that word usually means when people are just trying to express that something is bigger than expected. I mean structurally, geometrically, philosophically enormous. 7 concentric levels, each one spinning at a slightly different rate to account for the gravitational preferences of whichever species is housed on that ring. The inner levels 1 through 3 run almost Earth standard, comfortable for humans, acceptable for Keth. Levels 4 and 5 are the bridge zones, calibrated to split the difference between heavy grav and light grav environments. 6 and 7 are where things get interesting, or uncomfortable, depending on your biology. I spent my first week on Valen 6 walking like I was on the moon. My knees didn't know what to do with themselves. My inner ear filed a formal complaint. 3 weeks in, I was fine. That's the thing about humans, we adapt faster than most species expect us to. Level 7, Atrium D, was the main gathering space for the Cultural Exchange Program, a joint initiative between Earth's Diplomatic Corps and the Vethrani Interspecies Council that had been running for, at that point, 4 Earth years. The idea was simple enough on paper. Students from various species would spend a standard galactic year studying alongside each other, learning languages, cultural protocols, shared history, and whatever else you could cram into a curriculum designed by committee across 11 worlds. In practice, it was organized chaos. Lovable, occasionally beautiful, frequently exhausting chaos. The atrium itself was designed to be neutral ground, meaning the architects had spent enormous effort making it feel like it belonged to nobody in particular, which mostly meant it felt vaguely like an airport terminal that had been redesigned by someone who'd never used an airport. The floors were some kind of composite material, pale gray, slightly springy underfoot. The ceiling was transparent, one of those multi-layer environmental domes that could cycle through lighting conditions to simulate different planetary day cycles at different hours, which meant that at any given moment, One corner of the atrium might be bathed in something approximating Earth noon, while another section was lit in the deep amber of a Keth evening. There were tables that had been engineered with adjustable heights and surface tensions to accommodate species of varying sizes and with varying contact sensitivities. There were food dispensary stations along the eastern wall, each one configured for specific dietary requirements. And in the middle of all of it, 6 days a week during what the schedule called unstructured socialization hours, somewhere between 150 and 250 students would try to figure out how to exist near each other without starting an incident. They mostly succeeded. Mostly. Chapter 3, Myra Ose. She was sitting at table 14, third from the north wall, nearest the water feature that recycled atmospheric moisture through a series of filter columns that made a sound like soft rain, which the Keth students found calming, and which most of the human students had collectively agreed to pretend was a nice ambient noise rather than something deeply unsettling. Her name was Myra Osai, 23 years old, third-year student in the Exchange's interspecies relations track. From Accra, originally, though she'd grown up partly in London after her parents relocated when she was 9. She'd won the exchange placement through competitive examination, top scores in linguistic aptitude and cultural adaptation theory, both of which were, as she'd once told me, useless preparation for actually being here, but whatever. I knew her a little. Not well, the auxiliary staff weren't supposed to get too close to the student population, which was one of those regulations that exists for real reasons, and is also practically impossible to follow when you're sharing a station with the same people for a year. She'd helped me with a translation crisis during my second month on station, when a miscommunication between myself and a Vithrani maintenance crew had nearly resulted in the water recycling system being shut down entirely during a scheduled maintenance window. She'd appeared out of nowhere, smoothly stepped in, explained my request in terms the crew chief could actually work with, and then disappeared before I could even properly thank her. After that, we'd nod when we passed in corridors, exchange maybe 3 words at the food dispensary. She was the kind of person who filled a room with presence without seeming to try, which sounds like a compliment and is, but it also means she was the kind of person who drew attention. That day, she was sitting with a small group, 2 other human students, a Keth named Ciro who was doing something elaborate with a stack of study tablets, and an Orth student whose name I could never pronounce right and who'd told me, during one memorable conversation, to just call them Loop, which I gathered was something close to their naming root phoneme rather than an actual nickname. She was eating and laughing at something Ciro had just done with the tablets, some kind of visual joke that involved stacking them in a configuration that somehow implied an insult in 3 different languages simultaneously. I couldn't hear them from where I was standing, but I could see she was fully present, relaxed, head tilted back with genuine laughter. That was the moment. Right there between 1 second and the next. Her hair was natural, she kept it in a high puff most days, neatly shaped, and it was remarkable in a room where most of the other humanoids either had no hair at all or had the kind of straight, fine hair that laid flat and still. It moved when she moved. It was distinctive. And the Vithrani student at the next table reached out and grabbed a handful of it. Chapter 4, The Vithrani. I need to explain the Vithrani, because the story doesn't work without understanding them. They're not villains. I want to say that clearly from the start, because the way this incident got reported later made it easy to cast the whole thing into a good species bad species narrative that misses the point entirely and does a disservice to everyone involved. The Vithrani are biologically, culturally, historically, a tactile species. Where humans use eye contact as a primary signal of engagement and interest, the Vithrani use touch. Where humans say, "I see you," as an expression of acknowledgement, the Vithrani equivalent is something closer to "I reach toward you." Their entire social architecture is built on a framework of physical contact that is, within their culture, as nuanced and codified as human facial expressions. A touch on the shoulder means one thing. A touch on the forehead means something else entirely. The way you make contact with someone's hair, which is a significant sensory structure for many Vithrani subgroups, a kind of secondary antenna almost, communicates a specific class of social message about curiosity or aesthetic admiration. In Vithrani cultural context, touching another person's hair is roughly equivalent to saying, "That's interesting, I want to understand it better." In human cultural context, particularly in the cultural context of a young black woman from Ghana by way of London who has spent her entire life navigating a world that has opinions about her hair, it means something very, very different. The student's name was Kaval, full name something I couldn't reproduce without specialized vocal hardware, but Kaval was the shortened form he used with non-Vithrani. He was in his second year, 19 by Vithrani reckoning, which put him at approximately 26 Earth equivalent, and by every account I'd heard from the staff who dealt with him regularly, he was a good student, curious, a little careless, socially. He had a habit of acting before his reasoning caught up, which was a known challenge for younger Vithrani students adjusting to multi-species environments. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He just didn't think. He reached over from his table, reached far enough that it required him to half stand, which means he was deliberate about it. He wasn't brushing past her accidentally. And he grabbed a handful of Myra's hair and pulled it toward him to look at it more closely. The way you might reach out to touch a fabric at a market stall, the way you might examine something that caught your eye. The sound. That's what I heard first. A small, sharp sound, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp, that came from Myra the moment it happened. A sound I still can't fully describe because it wasn't just pain and it wasn't just surprise. It was both of those things wrapped around something older and more complicated. Something that lived in her history and her body, and the specific weight of what it means for that particular kind of contact to happen to you without warning or permission. I was moving before I'd consciously decided to move. Chapter 5, 3 seconds. Here's what happened in the 3 seconds between the pull and the slap, as best I can reconstruct it. In second 1, Myra's body reacted before her mind caught up. I could see it from across the room, the sudden stillness, the head jerking back from the pull, the hand coming up instinctively. That pure physical reflex of someone who has been grabbed and doesn't know yet by what or why. In second 2, she turned. She turned and she saw Kaval, saw him there with her hair still loosely in his fingers, looking at it with this expression on his face that was, I later learned from staff who knew Vithrani body language well, an expression of genuine aesthetic appreciation. Open curiosity. The Vithrani version of "wow, that's beautiful." He had absolutely no idea anything was wrong. He was smiling. In second 3, something happened in Myra's face that I have thought about a lot since, because it wasn't rage, not exactly. Or not only rage, it was something more layered than that. She understood in that second that he didn't know. I think she understood it almost immediately because Myra was smart and she'd been doing cross-cultural coursework for 3 years and she could read a room. But understanding someone doesn't mean you're not still hurt. Understanding doesn't automatically reach back through your nervous system and cancel the alarm that's already firing. Her hand came up, and she slapped him. Not a theatrical slap. Not the kind you see in dramatized versions of events like this, all wide arc and emphasis. It was quick and flat and practical, the kind of slap that happens when the body is making its own decisions and the brain is just watching. Palm on cheek. The sound of it cut through the ambient noise of the cafeteria the way sharp sounds do in large spaces, sudden, total, then silence. And then the entire atrium froze. Chapter 6, The Silence. You ever been in a room when something happens that nobody knows how to process yet? That's what the next 4 seconds felt like, Every conversation in the atrium stopped. I don't mean people trailed off gradually. I mean it was like someone had cut the audio feed. 200 students from 11 species, all of them suspended in that moment of collective not knowing, staring at table 14, and the two young people at the center of it. Cavell was holding his face, not because the slap had been particularly hard. The Vithrani have a higher pain tolerance than humans, and honestly I don't think the physical impact was the issue. He was holding his face because he was shocked, because whatever he'd expected to happen, it wasn't that. You could see him scrambling through his mental database of interspecies behavioral norms trying to find a framework for what had just occurred. Myra had her hand still raised, not threatening, just still there, like her arm hadn't gotten the message yet that the action was complete. Her chest was rising and falling quickly, her eyes were bright. And then the doors on the northeast side of the atrium opened. That's when it got complicated. Chapter 7, General Kavath. I want to tell you that I saw him coming, that I had time to think, to prepare, to position myself correctly. But the truth is I was already crossing the room toward table 14, and my attention was fully on Myra and Cavell, and I didn't register the retinue coming through the doors until I heard the change in the room's ambient sound. You can tell when someone important walks into a space. It's a frequency shift, a settling, the way the air pressure seems to change even when it objectively doesn't. General Kavath Siren was the senior Vithrani military attaché to Valen Station. He was there on a standard diplomatic tour, had been on station for 4 days, was scheduled to leave in 2. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful non-human figures in the Kareth corridor, which is the kind of sentence that only sounds impressive until you're in the same room with him, and then it becomes very concrete and very immediate. He was tall even by Vithrani standards, which run about 30% taller than an average human. His secondary crest was fully displayed, which in Vithrani body language indicates formal authority status. He had 3 aides flanking him and 2 security personnel behind, all of them in the pale blue-gray of Vithrani military formal attire. They had been scheduled for a brief observation of the exchange's socialization facilities as part of the diplomatic tour, a goodwill gesture. Come see how well we're all getting along. They walked in approximately 40 seconds after the slap, into the absolute silence of an atrium where every single student was still frozen, and a human girl and a Vithrani student were still in the exact posture of the moment after. Kavath stopped walking. His aide stopped. His security personnel's hands moved toward their sides in a gesture that required no translation whatsoever. And his eyes, which were silver-gray in the way of older Vithrani, the iris filling almost the entire eye, went from Cavell's face, which was still red, to Myra's hand, which was still raised, to the gap between them that told the whole story without words. He started walking again, but this time he was walking toward them. Chapter 8, I started running. I don't know exactly what I thought I was going to do. I had half a protein wrap and a monitoring tablet, and no specific authority to intervene in what was rapidly becoming an interspecies diplomatic incident. My job was auxiliary security, which meant I was supposed to observe and report, not place myself between a 3-star alien general and a 23-year-old student. But I was running, and Myra hadn't moved. She should have stepped back. She should have lowered her hand. She should have done a dozen things that would have been the rational, self-preserving response to a high-ranking military official from the species of the student. She just struck crossing the room toward her with that particular expression on his face. She watched him come. I've thought about this a lot since, what it takes to hold your ground in a moment like that. Not aggressive ground, she wasn't squaring up, she wasn't bracing for a fight. She just stood there, or sat there rather, she was still on her stool and she watched him approach with an expression that I can only describe as fully present. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't performing bravery either, it wasn't theatrical. She just wasn't leaving. Kaveth stopped 2 paces from her table. His aides formed up behind him. His security personnel had stopped about 5 meters back. The entire atrium was still holding its collective breath. He said something in Vethrani. Formal register. I could tell that much from the rhythm of it, even though I don't speak the language with any fluency. Myra answered him. In Vethrani. Chapter 9, what she said. I found out later, from the transcripts, that the station's ambient audio systems had captured exactly what was said. The station kept audio logs of the common areas for security purposes, and after the incident became officially documented, the transcripts became part of the record. She didn't answer him in the formal register he'd used. She answered him in the everyday register, what Vethrani linguists call the peer address mode, which was either an insult or an equalizing gesture depending on your interpretation, and the fact that the entire exchange later got debated by people who had strong opinions about it tells you that it was, at minimum, significant. What she said, translated as closely as the translation algorithm could manage, was something like, "He touched my head without asking. In my culture, that is not done without permission. I responded as my body required. I am not sorry for my response, but I am willing to explain it." Kaveth said nothing for a moment. Then he said, still in formal register, "You struck a Vethrani student." She said, still in peer register, "He grabbed me without warning." I would like to know what the Vethrani protocol is for that. Another pause. There is no Vethrani protocol for that, he said, because we do not grab without intention of connection. Then we have something to discuss, Myra said, about what counts as connection. She was 23 years old, alone at a table with a galactic general 2 paces from her face, and she was conducting a philosophical negotiation. I stopped running. I was close enough to intervene if I needed to, but something in my legs made the executive decision that running into the middle of this would not help. I stood at the edge of the space and I watched. Chapter 10. The weight of history in a single moment. Here's the thing about working on a joint interspecies station for any length of time. You stop seeing individual moments as isolated incidents. Everything connects to everything else. Every cultural miscommunication, every accidental slight, every misread gesture carries the weight of the entire history of contact between 2 species. When Cavell grabbed Myra's hair, he wasn't doing it maliciously. But malice isn't the only way to cause harm. His curiosity, his cultural framework, his assumption that reaching out was a form of appreciation rather than an invasion, all of that crashed into her history and her body's memory without his knowing anything about it. And she'd responded with her own history and her own body, which didn't stop to consult his intentions before reacting. And now Kaveth was standing in front of her, and behind him were 400 years of Vethrani human contact history, most of it careful and complicated, and only recently moving towards something that might be called mutual respect, and one slap had landed in the middle of all of it like a stone in still water. I was watching the ripples. Kaveth was silent for what felt like a long time. His crest had flattened slightly, which, I later learned, in Vethrani body language indicates a shift from formal authority posture to something more open, more considering. He looked at Cavell, said something short and sharp in Vethrani, command register not formal. Cavell straightened immediately. Then he looked back at Myra. "Explain," he said, in standard galactic this time, clear and direct. And she did. Chapter 11, The Explanation. Myra Ose had 3 years of cross-cultural coursework, and a mother who taught her that any room you walk into, you should be able to explain yourself clearly and leave with your dignity intact. She talked for about 4 minutes. I timed it afterward when I reviewed the audio transcripts. She talked about what hair means in her cultural background, and not in an academic way, not the sanitized. In my culture, hair has significant social meaning, phrasing that gets used in cultural briefing documents. She talked about it personally. She talked about what it was like to grow up in spaces where people assumed they had the right to touch and comment on and form opinions about her hair. She talked about what it means for that assumption to come at you without warning, even from someone who means no harm. How the body's alarm system doesn't have a filter for intentions. How you can understand and still feel. How she'd felt the grab before she'd seen who it was coming from, and her hand had moved before her mind had a chance to intervene. She said, "I don't know what touch means where you're from. I believe it was meant well. But I need you to understand that where I'm from, that specific contact has a specific history, and I carry that history in my body even when I don't want to." She said, "I shouldn't have slapped him," or "I shouldn't have needed to. Those are different statements and both of them are true." She said, "I'm still not sorry. But I'm willing to be sorry differently, if that makes sense to you." The atrium was so quiet I could hear the water feature cycling. Kavath was still looking at her. His expression, I don't have good Vithrani vocabulary for it. He's not a species whose face maps neatly onto human emotional categories. But something in the way he was holding himself had shifted from the moment he'd first crossed the room. "You speak our language," he said. "Conversational level," she said. "I still get the formal registers wrong." "You are not using the formal register with me." "No," she said. "Why?" She met his eyes, which takes some deliberate effort because silver-gray Vithrani irises are slightly bioluminescent, and looking directly at them for extended periods requires that your own visual system adjusts. "Because you were talking to me like I was a problem to be managed," she said. "And I'm not. I'm a person explaining a thing that happened." Chapter 12. What Kavath Did. He was silent for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then General Kavath Siren, senior Vithrani military attaché, third highest-ranking Vithrani official on Valen Station, turned to Cable. He spoke in Vithrani, everyday register, which I'm told is significant, and what he said, translated approximately, was, "You reached without asking, which is something a child does. You are not a child. You will learn from this." Then he turned back to Myra. "The protocols for head touching in my culture require reciprocal willingness," he said. "This is a standard we hold. It was not observed here. That is a failure." He paused. "The student will be formally educated on the matter." Myra nodded, just once even. "I'll submit a formal account to the exchange coordinators," she said. "So there's a record." "That is appropriate," Kavath said. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, "You said where you are from. That contact has a specific history. I would be interested in understanding that history more fully. The exchange program has detailed modules on Vithrani sensory culture. I am not aware of equivalent material explaining the human context you described." It wasn't quite an apology. It wasn't exactly an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was a Vithrani general telling a 23-year-old student that she'd identified a gap in the curriculum, and he thought it should be filled. Which is, in its way, something. Myra looked at him for a long moment. "I'd be willing to help develop that module," she said, "if the exchange program is interested." Chapter 13. The Atrium After. The moment Kavath turned and walked back toward his retinue, the atrium let out a collective exhale. 200 students, 11 species, all of them breathing again. The conversations didn't restart immediately. They crept back in, low and cautious, the way sound returns after a loud noise. I walked over to table 14. Myra was sitting with her hands flat on the table. Loop was very close to her on one side, not touching but present in that particular way where presence functions as contact. The human students on her other side were also close. Ciro had set down the tablets and was watching her with the kind of careful attention that said he'd understood more of what had happened than most of the room had. "Hey," I said, because I am, at my core, a person who says hey in situations where no other opener seems adequate. She looked up at me. "Hey, Sergeant. You okay?" She thought about it. Actually thought about it, which I appreciated more than I can say, because the automatic "I'm fine" would have been a lie and we both would have known it. "I'm going to be," she said. "Give me 20 minutes and some water." I put my monitoring tablet down on the table and sat across from her. "That was," I started. "Terrifying," she said. I was going to say remarkable. "Both," she said, simultaneously. Ciro pushed a water container toward her. She took it. "Did I handle that right?" she asked, not to me specifically, to the air. "You handled it the way you handled it," Loop said, their translator rendering it in that particular soft register that meant something close to it was real, and that's what matters. "The slap part," she said. I don't know if I should have." "He grabbed your hair," the human student to her right said flatly. Name was Dev, I remembered, sharp kid, physics track. "In the middle of lunch, without asking, he grabbed your hair." "I know," she said. "So?" "I know," she said again. "I know, I just need to sit with it." She took a long drink of water. Across the atrium, Kavath and his retinue were speaking with the exchange program coordinators who had arrived, slightly breathless, approximately 2 minutes too late to be useful. Cavell was sitting at his table, alone now, his usual group having quietly shifted away in the way young people do when they don't know what to do with someone who's just been publicly corrected. He was looking at the table. His face was still slightly red. I watched him for a moment. He looked up, caught me watching. I held his gaze for a second, not hostile, just present. He looked back down. Chapter 14, The Long Afternoon. The rest of the day was the slow, grinding work of incident management. Statements to be given, forms to be filed, coordinators to be briefed. The exchange program's diplomatic liaison appeared and wanted to talk to Myra for 40 minutes about the cultural sensitivity of the response, in a way that I thought was deeply wrong in its framing, but wasn't my meeting to derail. I stayed close. Not in the meeting, I wasn't authorized, but in the corridor outside, where I could hear the tone of conversation even if not the words. She came out looking tired. "How was that?" I asked. "Like being told to apologize for being grabbed," she said. "Did you?" "No." "Good." She looked at me. "Will I get in trouble for that?" "For not apologizing for being grabbed? I hope not." "For the slap?" I thought about it honestly. I don't know. The protocols on physical altercation are somewhat written for conflicts, not, whatever that was. I think the fact that Kavath didn't push for formal sanction helps. The fact that you gave that explanation in front of 200 witnesses helps. "What about Cavell?" "He'll receive a cultural sensitivity review," I said. "It's in the program handbook. Any student who demonstrates insufficient awareness of another student's cultural physical boundaries gets reviewed. It's usually pretty gentle, but it's on record." She nodded. "He didn't mean to hurt me," she said. "I know. I know he knows that now." She paused. "I'm still not sorry. Is that okay?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," I said, "that's okay." Chapter 15. What I wrote in my report. I filed my incident report that evening. I wrote it 3 times before I submitted it. The first version was too sparse, just the clinical facts, which technically covered my obligations but felt like it was lying by omission. The second version was too much. I'd started to editorialize about cultural curriculum gaps and interspecies contact protocols, and the inadequacy of the diplomatic liaison's framing of the conversation with Myra, and by page 4 I'd basically written a small thesis. The third version, was what I actually submitted. It covered what happened in sequence with enough detail to be accurate. It noted that the student's response was a reflex response to uninvited physical contact, that the responding general had declined to pursue formal sanction, that the student had engaged in a direct and substantive exchange with the general that had, in my assessment, reduced rather than escalated the incident's potential diplomatic weight. The last line I wrote was, "Recommend review of cultural contact protocols in orientation materials, with particular attention to the gap between Vethrani tactile customs and human bodily autonomy frameworks. Current documentation is insufficient for either species to navigate the intersection without incident." I don't know if anyone read it. I suspect someone did eventually, because about 6 weeks later, a new module appeared in the exchange program's orientation curriculum: Physical Contact Across Species, Meaning, Permission, and Cultural History. It was co-developed, the credit line said, by a student researcher in the interspecies relations track. Myra Osei. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Aftermath. Chapter 1, 3 weeks later. 3 weeks after the incident in Atrium D, I was summoned to a meeting I hadn't requested in a room I'd never been to, by an official whose name I'd only seen on organizational charts. The summons came through the standard auxiliary notification system at 700 station time, logged as a routine coordination briefing, which anyone who's worked in any institutional system for more than 6 months knows is never actually routine. The only meetings that get called routine in the subject line are the ones someone didn't want to put an accurate description on because the accurate description would cause people to ask questions. I put on my best duty uniform, which is to say the one without the protein wrap stain from 3 weeks prior, and I went. The room was on level 3, which was the administrative core of the station, all solid walls, no atmospheric dome, standard artificial lighting in the particular shade of off-white that signals this is a professional space and you should behave accordingly. The kind of room designed to communicate that what happens in it matters. There was a rectangular table. On one side of it, Commander Aldrich Chen, who ran the exchange program's human diplomatic coordination. 2 coordinators I recognized from the program, and which was the thing that made me stop in the doorway for just a moment, General Kavathrel Siren. He was supposed to have left the station 17 days ago. He was still here. Chapter 2, Why He'd Stayed. Kavathrel Siren had extended his stay on Valen Station by 3 weeks, citing ongoing consultation with Exchange Program Administration on matters of interspecies educational framework. Which was true as far as it went. What it didn't mention was that the reason for the ongoing consultation was, at least partially, a 23-year-old student named Myra Osei. I learned this gradually, in pieces, as the meeting in the Level 3 room unfolded. Commander Chen explained that in the aftermath of the incident, General Kavath had requested a series of extended briefings on human cultural frameworks, specifically those pertaining to embodied history, what Chen delicately called the intersection of historical experience and physiological response, and the ways in which those frameworks differ from Vethrani sensory culture. These briefings had been conducted partly by the program's cultural liaison staff, and partly, apparently, and here Commander Chen paused in a way that suggested he still wasn't entirely sure how he felt about it, by Myra herself, who had been invited to speak at one of them, and had then been asked to come back for a second session, and then a third. I looked across the table at Kavath during this explanation. He was watching me with those silver-gray eyes in the way that I'd come to associate, over 3 weeks of occasionally sharing common spaces with him, as his version of neutral attentiveness. He showed very little in the face, by human standards, but he showed things in the way he held his crest, in the angles of his secondary jaw, in the particular quality of his stillness. He was, I'd decided, a careful and intelligent person who had made a career out of not showing people what he was thinking until he was ready for them to know. "Why am I here?" I asked. Because I'd been watching careful and intelligent people in meetings for long enough to know when you've spent enough time on setup. "You filed the incident report," Chen said. "Yes." "You also filed a recommendation regarding curriculum gaps." "Yes." "We'd like to discuss both, and we'd like you involved in the next phase of what we're developing." I looked at Kaveth again. He said, "I requested your presence specifically. You were the observer present throughout the incident. You acted as informal witness in the absence of authorized personnel." A pause. "Your account was more complete than the official record." "It was my personal observation," I said. "Yes, which is what I am interested in." Chapter 3. The thing Kaveth said that I keep thinking about. Here's the moment from that meeting that has stayed with me the longest. We were about 40 minutes in. We'd covered the curriculum gap issue, the proposed structure of the new contact protocols module, the question of how to document and formalize Myra's contribution, given that she was a student rather than a staff member, and there were some administrative questions about credit and compensation. Standard institutional problem solving. Then there was a pause in the conversation, one of those natural breaks where everyone reaches for their water containers and the room breathes for a moment. And Kaveth said something that wasn't in response to anything specific that had just been said. He said, "I have been in formal diplomatic contexts with human representatives for 11 of your years. I have attended briefings and round tables and legislative sessions. I have read extensive documentation on human culture." He paused. "In none of that time did I understand, as a material rather than academic fact, that there are categories of physical contact that carry historical memory in the human body, that your history lives in your tissues, not only in your texts." The room was quiet. "Miss Ose explained it to me not as a principle," he said, "but as a personal experience. She explained it in a way that required me to understand it as something that has happened to a person I was speaking with, not as something that happened to a category." He set down his water container. "There is a significant difference. Our diplomatic documentation does not capture that difference." Commander Chen started to say something about the curriculum redesign, and I understood what he was doing, bridging back to the practical from the philosophical. But Kaveth continued. "She was 23 years old and she was sitting alone at a table, and I walked toward her with the full weight of my formal position and she did not move," he said. "I have encountered that quality in people on perhaps 7 occasions in my life. It is not stubbornness. It is not aggression. It is something I would call groundedness, but that word in our language implies geological metaphor and perhaps yours does not translate the same way." He looked at me. "What would you call it?" I thought about it. "Knowing who you are," I said, "even when it would be easier not to." He held my gaze for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that." Chapter 4. Myra 3 weeks in. I saw her that afternoon after the meeting. She was in one of the study alcoves off the main corridor on level 6, the ones with the slightly more forgiving gravity and the good light, with a tablet open and a second one on the table beside her, and she had the expression of someone in the middle of complicated thinking. "Can I sit?" I asked. She gestured at the bench across from her. "How are the sessions going?" I asked. "The briefings." She didn't look up from the tablet immediately. "You heard about those." "I was just in a meeting about them." She looked up. "Oh. They want to formalize your involvement, give you a research credit, possibly a co-development role on the new module." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't trying to make something of it," she said. "The first time they asked me to come talk to them, I thought I was going to be asked to explain myself, you know, like a debrief. I didn't expect him to be actually listening." "He was actually listening." "Yeah, she stopped, turned the tablet face down in the way people do when they need to be fully in a conversation. He asked me questions, real questions, not the diplomatic kind where there's already an answer embedded in the phrasing. He asked what it felt like, not what it meant culturally, not what the protocol implications were, what it felt like. She shook her head slightly. I wasn't prepared for that. What did you tell him? She thought about it. I told him it felt like being reminded that some people will always think your body is available for their curiosity, and that it doesn't matter how much you know intellectually about their intentions. When it happens, you feel it with every iteration of every time it's happened before, all at once, like your nervous system keeps a ledger. She picked up her water container. He went very still when I said that, and then he said, in Vithrani, we have a concept. He used the word, and I don't have the right mouth for it, but it translates roughly as ancestral body memory, for the way generational experience manifests as physical instinct. We consider it a sacred inheritance. She looked at me. I cried a little, which was embarrassing. Was it? It was. And then he said crying in Vithrani culture is a form of truth-telling, so I could stop being embarrassed, which somehow made it worse. She smiled, the first real one I'd seen from her since the incident. He's strange, she said, not how I expected a general to be. How did you expect him to be? Harder, less curious, like someone who had already decided what things meant. She paused. He asks questions like someone who suspects he's been missing something important and is slightly annoyed at himself for it. Chapter 5, Cavil. I want to tell you about Cavil too, because his part in this story doesn't end at the moment of the slap. About a week after the incident, he requested a meeting with Myra through the exchange program's formal channel, not directly, which shows some situational awareness, and not through his family's diplomatic connections, which I suspect he was advised against. Through the channel, a formal request for a restorative conversation, which is one of the mechanisms the exchange program has developed for exactly these situations. Myra had the right to decline. She spent 2 days thinking about it. She told me later that she was aware that she didn't owe him anything, not forgiveness, not her time, not the emotional labor of making him feel better about something he'd done. She knew that. She thought about it clearly. She agreed because she wanted to understand him, she said, not for his sake. For hers. The meeting was facilitated by one of the program's cultural liaison officers and lasted about an hour. I don't have access to the transcript. Restorative conversations are confidential, but Myra told me afterward, in pieces over the following week, what had happened. Cavil had tried several times in the conversation to explain the Vithrani context for what he'd done. The liaison had gently redirected each time. We're not here to debate context. We're here to understand impact. Cavil had found this difficult. He was, she said, genuinely smart and genuinely remorseful, but he kept wanting the conversation to be about his intentions, and each time the conversation moved back to her experience, he had to visibly reorient. At one point, she said, she told him, I know you meant it as a compliment. That's the part that's hard to explain. It's not that it would have been better if you'd meant it unkindly. It's that the kindness of your intention doesn't reach back through time and change what grabbing someone's hair without asking has meant, historically, for people who look like me. Your intention and my experience are both real. They just happened in different rooms. He'd gone quiet after that, for a long time. Then he'd said, I did not know there were rooms I was not in. And she'd said, that's the thing, though. Not knowing about a room doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you've never had to be in it. She said that by the end of the meeting, she wasn't friends with him. She didn't expect to be, but she'd felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite release, and was maybe something closer to the satisfaction of having been fully heard. He understood it, she said. Not everything, maybe not most of it, but enough that I knew he'd actually received it instead of just waiting for me to finish so he could explain himself again. That's not nothing. Chapter 6: The Broadcast. I found out about the news coverage the same way most people on the station did. Someone told me, urgently, in a corridor. It was PVT. Yusuf jogging toward me with the expression of someone delivering information they weren't sure was good or bad. "Sergeant, the incident, the atrium incident, it's on the feeds." "Which feeds?" "All of them, or most of them. The Vethrani public feed picked it up from the council, and then the human news aggregators pulled from that. He held out his personal comm. I looked at the screen. The headline on the human feed read, "Human Exchange Student Confronts VOTHRANI General After Student GRABS Hair, Station, ERUPTS." Which was not entirely inaccurate in the loosest possible interpretation of several of those words. The Vethrani feed headline, as translated by Yusuf's device, Terran Student Initiates Direct Address with General KOVATH, Bodily Autonomy Discussion Triggers Curriculum Review, which was somehow more accurate and also more alarming. I went directly to find Commander Chen. Chapter 7: The Press Question. The media situation was, in Chen's words, manageable but requiring management, which is the kind of sentence that means it isn't manageable without significant effort. The human feeds had gone with the emotional angle, "Brave student stands up to alien general," which was technically accurate in the same way that describing a symphony as a series of notes is technically accurate. The Vethrani feeds had gone with the institutional angle, which meant it was being covered in the context of diplomatic relations and educational policy and Kavath's decision to extend his stay, which at least meant the conversation was somewhat substantive even if it was somewhat bloodless. There were, Chen told me, already 4 requests for Myra to give interviews. 2 from human outlets, 2 from Vethrani public media. She had declined all 4. She explained it to me that afternoon. "I didn't do that for a story. I didn't do it to be an example. I did it because I was there and it happened, and I responded the way I responded." She was looking out one of the observation windows on level 6. The Kareth corridor spread out beyond the transparently, stars and slow-moving navigation beacons, and the distant light scatter of another station 2 systems over. If I do interviews, it becomes about me being brave or me being a symbol, and then people don't think about the actual thing. They just think about the version of me that fits whatever story they already wanted to tell. "That's a mature read," I said. "My mother would call it too smart for your own peace of mind," she said, which she says as a compliment but also as a warning. "What does she think about all this?" Myra smiled. She cried, then she said she was proud, then she said I should always carry myself like my grandmother was watching, then she cried again. She was quiet for a moment. My grandmother grew up in a time when that exact kind of contact, someone reaching out to touch her hair, to examine it without asking, was so ordinary she wouldn't have thought to describe it as something that happened to her. It just happened, constantly, casually, by people who meant it perfectly kindly and had no idea. She pressed one finger lightly to the observation window. "And now I'm here in this station, at the edge of a different corridor of history, and it happened again with a completely different species, and I'm apparently a news story." "Are you okay?" I asked. She considered it. "I keep having this thought," she said, "about how the specific thing that happened to me, the hair pulling, is something that connects me to every woman who looks like me who's ever had someone reach for their hair because they found it interesting. That I'm not the first person to have that reflex response. That my great-grandmother had that reflex. That it traveled through time inside my nervous system, and it fired before I could think about it." She turned from the window. "And then I think, what does it mean to carry something in your body that wasn't done to you, but that happened to people you come from? And I don't have an answer, but Kavath called it ancestral body memory, and I think he's right, even if he doesn't know all the history that's in it." Chapter 8: The Module. The development process for the new curriculum module took 6 weeks after my meeting with Chen and Kavath. I was peripherally involved. My incident report formed part of the baseline documentation, and I attended 2 of the working sessions as an observer. Myra was the lead human contributor. She worked alongside 2 Vithrani cultural scholars that Kavath had arranged to remain on station for the project, and the exchange program's existing curriculum team. The process was not smooth. There were genuine disagreements about framing, about emphasis, about which aspects of human history needed to be included, and at what depth, about whether the module should be structured as cultural education or as an ethics framework or as something else entirely. There was a session in the 3rd week that I heard about secondhand that apparently lasted 4 hours and covered the difference between cultural curiosity and cultural entitlement, and whether that distinction can be clearly enough defined to be teachable. Myra came out of that session looking like someone who'd run a long distance. She sat down heavily in the corridor outside the conference room and stared at the wall for a few minutes without speaking. "Bad?" I asked. "Productive," she said eventually. "I think. I'm not sure productive and painful are mutually exclusive." "They're definitely not." One of the Vithrani scholars kept saying, "The intention structures the meaning," as a principle, and I kept having to explain that in human experience, intention and impact are not reliably linked, and they couldn't quite get why that's a structural problem rather than a solvable misunderstanding. She rubbed her face. "And then eventually," I said, "if I have been stepped on 1,000 times and the 1,001st time someone steps on me and says they didn't mean to, my foot does not care about their intentions." And there was a very long silence, and then one of them said, "Your foot is the record keeper." And I said, "Yes, that's exactly right." And then we got somewhere. "Your foot is the record keeper," I repeated. "I know, it's going in the module," direct quote. Chapter 9, General Kavath's last day first attempt. He'd extended his stay twice. The second extension was formally because of the curriculum project, but 3 days before the module was completed, he was called back, standard military rotation, the kind of recall that doesn't get argued with even by 3-star generals. He scheduled a formal departure for what would have been a Tuesday morning on Earth. Not that the days of the week mean anything on a station, but I've always kept Earth time in my head as a reference point. I came to know about the departure because I was on corridor duty that morning, and his route from his quarters to the docking bay took him through my sector. He stopped when he passed me. "Sergeant Marsh," he said. "General," I said. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I have considered telling Commander Chen, but that I think is more appropriately said to you." I waited. "Your report," he said, "the incident report, I read it, the full version including the recommendation. It was the most accurate account of what occurred that I encountered. The official version lacked," he paused, finding the word, "context, the material context, what it meant inside the moment, not only what occurred as event." He looked at me steadily. "You saw the incident clearly because you were close enough and because you already understood that 2 histories were meeting, not only 2 individuals. That kind of seeing is not common. It is a specific skill, and I think you do not give yourself enough credit for having it." I didn't know what to say to that. "I gave Chen a recommendation," he said, "for your auxiliary classification. There are interspecies liaison positions on the diplomatic track that would suit your observation style, if that is something you want." Then he nodded once and walked on. Chapter 10, Myra's goodbye to Kavath. I wasn't there for it, but she told me later. He'd stopped by the study alcoves before going to the docking bay. She was there. She was always there in the mornings, and she saw him coming down the corridor with his retinue at the standard 3-pace distance. He stopped at the entrance to the alcove. "The module will be completed without me," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll make sure it's good." "It will be," he said, Because of you. She stood up. Not because she had to, he wasn't issuing a formal interaction, but because the moment seemed to require it. Can I ask you something? She said. He inclined his head. When you walked over to us that day in the atrium, what did you think you were going to do? He was quiet for a moment. I thought, he said carefully, that I was going to address a breach of order. That is what the situation appeared to be. A student had been struck. I am the ranking Vithrani official on station. I thought I was going to manage an incident. And then you answered me, he said. And it was not the answer of someone who needed to be managed. It was the answer of someone who had already done the work of knowing where she stood. A pause. I found that I was no longer managing an incident. I was in a conversation. The two are different. Myra nodded. I'm glad it was a conversation, she said. As am I, he said. I came in believing I understood the relevant facts. I left having been educated. A long pause. That happens rarely at my age and rank. I am grateful for it. He left. She stood in the alcove for a while after she told me, not doing anything, just sitting with it. Chapter 11, What the Module Covers. I got a copy of the final module before it was integrated into the curriculum. I read it in my quarters, the night before it went live. It's called simply, Bodies, Borders, and Contact, a Cross-Species Framework. It opens with a section on tactile cultures. Not just Vithrani, but 4 other species in the exchange program whose primary social bonding and communication mechanisms involve physical contact. It explains each culture's norms in detail, with specific attention to what touch means, when it's appropriate, and crucially, what the requesting or consent protocols look like within each culture. Then it has a section on cultures where body autonomy functions as a primary ethical framework, human being the anchor case, but not the only one. It explains that in these cultures, physical contact without permission is experienced not only as a boundary violation, but often as a signal carrying historical associations, and it goes into some of that history for the human case specifically. There's a subsection. I recognized Myra's hand in the phrasing called the record keeper. It explains how the body accumulates experience, how reflexes form, how the same action can carry different meanings depending on the histories the body receiving it has been part of. It does not ask people from one culture to disavow their norms. It asks them to understand that their norms exist in contact with other norms, and that intention and impact are not always the same thing. The final section is about what to do when contact crosses a boundary by mistake, not the diplomatic procedure, not the forms to file, the human part, the part about how to actually respond in the moment, how to acknowledge harm without making the acknowledgement about yourself, how to listen rather than explain, how to stay in the conversation even when it's uncomfortable. That section ends with a quote. No attribution given, just marked exchange program, veil and station. The quote is, understanding someone doesn't automatically cancel the alarm that's already firing. Both things are true. Stay in the room. Chapter 12, Exchange Year's End. Myra finished her exchange year 4 months after the atrium incident. The ceremony was in the main atrium, Atrium D, the same one, which I thought was either accidental or someone's idea of a meaningful gesture. She got her completion certificate and her research credit, and a formal commendation from the exchange program for exemplary contribution to intercultural educational development, which is the kind of institutional language that sounds impersonal until you know the story behind it. The commendation was signed, at the bottom, by General Kavethrel Siren, who was back on his home station by that point, but had apparently requested to be included as a co-signatory. I was there for the ceremony. Back on corridor duty, there's always corridor duty. She caught my eye when she came through the exit after the formal portion had ended. Stopped. Thanks, she said. For what? For running, she said. That day, even if you stopped. I stopped when I saw you didn't need me. I saw you stop, she said. It helped, knowing someone was close. I nodded. What are you going to do now? I asked. Go home for a month, she said. See my mother, eat actual food, she smiled. And then I've been offered a position. Interspecies relations, diplomatic track, liaison posting. She paused. Apparently someone put in a recommendation. I kept my expression even. Kaveth, I said. Someone, she said. Her eyes were warm. I said yes. Obviously. Chapter 13, The Last Thing. She left on a ship that departed from Docking Bay 7 on a Wednesday station time, which doesn't map to Earth days, but I've started marking things in station days now, which might mean I've been here long enough that it's become a kind of home. I didn't go to the bay. I'm not good at goodbyes, and she didn't need an audience. But I was on my monitoring shift at the time, which means I had the atrium feeds up. Atrium D was quiet, free period, no organized activities. A handful of students from the new cohort, most of them arriving in the weeks after Myra's group had finished their year. New faces from new worlds, just starting to learn how to exist near each other. At table 14, third from the north wall, nearest the water feature, a Vithrani student and a human student were sitting across from each other, sharing something on a tablet screen. I couldn't see what, but they were both laughing. The Vithrani student reached out, and I felt my hand tighten on the tablet and set their hand flat on the table, palm up. An open gesture, offering without taking. The human student looked at it for a moment, then reached out and put their hand in it. Both of them still laughing. I don't know if they'd read the module. I don't know if they'd heard about what happened in that atrium 3 months before. Maybe they were just two people figuring it out in the particular way that young people sometimes do, instinctively, in the direction of connection, reaching toward each other with something that looked almost like hope. That's the thing about that station. That's the thing about any place where species that have never had to understand each other are made to try. Sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes someone grabs without asking, and someone else's history fires back before either of them has time to think, and the whole careful structure of diplomatic goodwill vibrates from the impact. And sometimes, in the aftermath, you end up with a curriculum module that teaches 200 new students per year about the rooms they've never had to be in. And sometimes, at table 14, two strangers figure out how to offer before they take. And I think that's slowly, unevenly, sometimes painfully, what it looks like when different kinds of people start to actually become something like neighbors.